Hello and welcome back to Gapeys Garden. Today we're going to be talking about pruning tomatoes. So I prune my tomatoes 3 different ways, and I'm going to show you how I do each one and why. This is something I've been wanting to do a video on for quite a while. I've shown a little bit of pruning in some of my tomato updates in the past, and I always get a lot of questions about how I prune tomatoes, and I always forget which videos that I talked about it in. So now I can refer somebody to this particular video anytime somebody asks. All right, let's get to pruning. Now, the very first pruning I do with my tomatoes is actually during transplant time, and that's called bottom pruning. So what I do is remove the first few sets of leaves from the tomato, and I also do that throughout the season. So when the tomatoes are first starting to grow, the bottom leaves seem to get inundated by flea beetles, and you could see all these little holes in these leaves. So this is damage done by the flea beetle, and really does a number on the bottom leaves. But it only seems to affect the bottom leaves and not the upper leaves. So at this point, the tomato is pretty good size, so we don't really need these bottom leaves anymore, especially if they're damaged. So all I do is just kind of bend them up, and then I'm able to just snap that off. And we've got another one over here that's got some damage. So anytime you've got damage by bugs, or the leaves just don't look very good, it's always a good idea to take those off and remove those. And also anything that's touching the ground you also want to remove, because that could cause some diseases and fungus to get on your tomato plant, which is not a good thing. All right, so this one looks pretty good, and I'll probably come back and check this again in a few weeks and see how these bottom leaves are doing, and I may take off a few more. Now sometimes you'll have leaves that just completely get dried up, like this one. So this one would fall off eventually by itself, but we're going to go ahead and take that one off, as well as the one above it here that's got some leaf damage there. So we're just going to snap that off. Now, sucker pruning is another thing that I like to do throughout the season, and suckers are the growth that come out between the main stem here. So this is the main stem, and then it grows in between the main stem and a leaf stem. So this here is the sucker, so you can just take that and remove that. Now, one of the reasons I do that is because it helps with airflow. So if we get too many of those suckers in here, it'll get really dense and not get very good airflow. And if you're in a humid environment, that could cause some fungus like blight, which is very, very common here later in the season. So I always like to take care of that as early as possible. I try to prune my tomatoes down to 1 or 2 main stems. So sometimes, like this one, you might get your tomato will fork at the bottom. So you can see that fork there. So it just kind of split off into 2 branches, and that's totally fine. So I usually like to keep it to no more than 2 at the bottom, and then as it grows up, I may let it branch out a little bit more towards the top. So you can see here, this was actually a sucker that I didn't prune, so that has become another kind of main stem towards the top, and it's got some flowers. So once it flowers, I usually just tend to leave it on, but we do like to keep those suckers at a minimum. Whether you prune suckers or not really depends a lot on your climate and also your growing season. So removing the suckers like this here also helps with the fruit that's set to grow a little bit more quickly, because the plant is focused more on the fruit development than growing these little suckers. Now, the last type of pruning that I do is top pruning, and that is usually done later in the season. I usually don't do it this time of the year, but when the tomatoes start getting super tall and start growing basically into one another, then I might cut the tops off just to cut them back some so they're not growing too crazy. But I do have some tomatoes in the greenhouse that are getting pretty tall, so let me take you over there and show you how I do that. These are the 2 tomatoes I have in the greenhouse. We've got Fortunia on the left, which is a large Italian paste tomato, And then we've got Mama Leone on the right, which is another Italian paste tomato. So look how tall these have grown. This one is actually growing out of the vent, which is probably not a good idea. When the vent closes at night, it could be a bad thing for the tomatoes. So we're going to go ahead and take the top off of these ones that are pretty much growing out the vent. Now when I'm doing top pruning, I usually try not to cut off any branches that have tomatoes already set. So we've got a tomato here, so I try not to cut that off, but we don't have any tomatoes really set up here. So what I'm going to do is cut it right above where the last tomato is set. So we got that there. Now this branch here is getting pretty tall and coming out the side here. So I'm going to cut this all the way back to the last set of flowers, which is right here. And then this branch here, we've got a tomato set right there. So I'm just going to cut this top part here off. And this one here is actually a sucker. This is the main stem right here. We've got a leaf branch here. So this is growing out of the middle. So this is one that got kind of big that I just missed cutting off. So we're going to cut that one off. And once they get really fat like this, it's a little bit harder to snap off. So you may need to get your pruners to cut that off. All right, so here we've got another tall one. We don't see any tomato set on this top part. So I'm just going to cut it back to where this flower set of flowers is here. So we'll just cut that off. All right, I think that is pretty good for now. We probably aren't going to see a whole lot more growth up here, so the plant will just focus on growing these flowers and tomatoes that are set out. All right, that is how I prune my tomatoes. If pruning tomatoes is something you do you do all three of those pruning techniques, or do you only do one or two? Let me know in the comments. Thanks for watching, and we'll talk to you again soon. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe. You can also find me on Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook.